So without further ado, let's welcome to the stage Drew Dellinger as we begin our exploration of how we can keep our hearts open and our creativity engaged while we're facing the climate and mass extinction crises, the racial, gender, social and economic injustice. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Hey, is this one, can we get this one on? So I got older since the last time I was here, and I need reading glasses now. Oh yeah, there they are. Awesome. Thank you. Might not be just the eyes. We are standing on a planet that is shooting through space, and it's time we started acting like it. We are standing on a planet that is shooting through space, and it's time we started acting like it. Imagine nations with freed imaginations. Imagine nations with freed imaginations. It's time for she who sees the way to seize the day, seize the hour, seize the levers of power, and be the change. We need all of us to face all of the past and move past it. I ain't gonna study war no more, except in history classes. Globalize liberation, planetize the movement. You can't stop the Earth's revolution. But the snafu was the half who would settle for half truth. I said the snafu was the half who would settle for half truth. So I'm at it again with a pad and a pen. Some things deserve to dissolve, and the last shall be first, and vice versa. You are floating on a planet. Act accordingly. Cryosphere melting 10 trillion tears to a vanishing planet. Earth, dream blossom of the cosmos, silent universe, speaking in species. Every cell is intelligent. Every cell is intelligent. Cultivate bioluminescence. The breath is the bridge. Imagine nations with freed imaginations. We are standing on a planet that is shooting through space, and it's time we started acting like it. Globalize liberation, planetize the movement. You can't stop the Earth's revolution. Thank you. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about some of the connections between ecology, social justice, and cosmology. I mean, it's probably clear to many people in this room that we're in an ecological crisis. I mean, that was kind of news to people 40 years ago. And now the headlines are filled with the consequences of our inaction for the last several decades. And so we're in a powerful time, an important time, an auspicious time, but certainly a time of crisis and a time of transformation. And I want to talk about cosmology, which is a word that, I expect is very familiar to some people and probably less familiar to others. But cosmology, so just to get us all on the same page, briefly, I'll just say some of the definitions of cosmology. Cosmology is most simply the study of the universe, right? Study of the cosmos, the study of the origin and development of the universe in its entirety as a whole. So, now we have modern scientific cosmology. We have astronomy, astrophysics. But cosmology is as ancient as human community. And every culture has had an origin story, has had creation myths, has had a fundamental, basic, primordial story of how the world came to be and how we as humans fit into it. So that's a deeper, richer definition of cosmology that would encompass all of the religious stories, the Buddhist cosmology, Islamic cosmology, Judeo-Christian cosmology, the cosmologies of Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism. So all of the indigenous traditions and their origin stories. So every culture has had a cosmology. Every culture has rooted itself in its fundamental sense of how the world came to be and how we fit into it. Now, the person who taught me about cosmology was a man named Thomas Berry. And I first met Thomas Berry in the summer of, I first met him in 1990, and I first studied with him closely in the summer of 1991. And I remember sitting with Thomas Berry in Assisi, Italy. And if you don't know Thomas Berry, it's spelled Berry, and he's one of the most influential environmental thinkers of our time, environmental writers. And he passed away in 2009 at 94 years old. But I was sitting with him, I was sitting in Assisi, Italy with one of the leading environmental thinkers of our time, and he was talking about the power of story. And Berry said, "It seems that we basically communicate meaning by narrative. It seems that we basically communicate meaning by narrative. At least that's my approach to things. That narrative is our basic mode of understanding." And as Thomas Berry was talking about the environmental crises of our time, talking about the depletion of soil, the despoiling of the oceans and the atmosphere, the mass extinction crisis, the overfishing of the seas, he said, "The difficulty that we're into has come to a large extent from the limitations and inadequacies of our story. And what we need, I think," said Thomas Berry, "and what we really have is a new story." This concept of a new story was something that Thomas Berry originally proposed in 1978 with the essay that he wrote called The New Story. And in 1978, he published this essay, so it was very forward-thinking. I mean, now you hear people talking about the need for a new story, and you hear people talking about the importance of story and worldview and narrative, but Berry was really, ahead of the curve on this, and so he was talking about this, over, I guess last year would have been the 40th anniversary of the publication of The New Story. And Thomas Berry's essay, The New Story, started like this. Berry wrote, "It's all a question of story. It's all a question of story." He said, "We are in trouble just now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, is no longer effective. Yet we have not learned the new story." And so what Berry was saying is that in Western culture, in modern Western society, it's not even modern. Well, now we're in modern. But the roots of this dysfunctional story go back to before the modern period. And Berry was saying is that the tragedy of Western society is that its story, or its cosmology, remember cosmology is the story that a culture tells itself about how the world came to be and how we fit into it. Berry said the tragedy of the Western story is that it was anthropocentric. What does anthropocentric mean? Human-centered. focused on the human. It's the only culture in the history of the planet that somehow convinced itself that nature was dead, that nature was inanimate, that nature was not spiritual, not sacred, not to be revered, but was physical, material, and was resources to be exploited. This is a little bit simplistic, but it's basically the essence of what Barry's analysis and critique of our modern dysfunction and the resulting ecological and social crisis. Thomas Barry was saying that in Western society and Western religion and in Western thinking and in Western philosophy, and deep and embedded in our emotional, spiritual, and psychological structures, that there was a separation between the human and the natural world, between the human order and the more than human realm. And this is the only culture in the history of the planet that took this bizarre turn and started teaching its children that nature was dead, inanimate, strictly matter. And in Barry's thinking, this was the fundamental problem with Western society. That was his one-word critique of all of the major institutions, that they were anthropocentric, human-centered. So you have the religious establishment, anthropocentric. You have the economic establishment, anthropocentric. Educational order, anthropocentric. And the political realm, all of these, the four major institutions of our society, religion, politics, economics, education, all perceived and perpetuated what Thomas Barry called a radical discontinuity, a radical separation between the human and the natural world. And so what Barry felt was that we needed to shake off this old story, and so you have this kind of anthropocentrism that is deeply embedded for hundreds and hundreds, a couple thousand years in the Western tradition. And then you have like the scientific revolution, and you have Descartes and Francis Bacon, and you have what is sometimes called the disenchantment of the world, a way in which the sense of the sacred and the irreverential, experiential connection to the soul or the spirit or the animating principle had disappeared. And so you have, like followers of Descartes saying that animals don't have souls. Animals, it's not even clear that they feel pain. I mean, if you go back and you read some of this stuff, it's striking. You literally had followers of Descartes saying that if you kick a dog and the dog yelps, that doesn't necessarily mean that the dog even feels pain, because, if you bang on a piano, the piano makes noise. You see what's happening? The Western consciousness is taking this sacred, spiritual reality that every culture in the history of the planet had regarded with reverence and treating it as strictly physical matter to be exploited for human greed, human resources. And so you have this disenchantment of the world. And so Barry felt that we needed to shake off this old story, this story of separation and of human-centeredness. And so sorry, I just want to finish this one other thought. So Barry's critique was that this radical discontinuity, this separation between the human and the natural world, was part of the deep roots of the ecological crisis. And if we wanted to solve the ecological crisis, we had to get to this level of religious, spiritual, cosmological worldview. I remember Thomas Barry saying one time, talking about the ecological destruction, and he would refer to it as a pathology. And at one point he said to me, I was sitting with him, he said, "The pathology is so deep, it can have no origin other than a religious origin." So what Thomas Berry felt is that we had to look at the level of worldview and cosmology if we wanted to understand the deep roots of the ecological crisis. Similar to Arne Naess's concept of deep ecology. If the ecological crisis is a shallow ecological crisis, then a shallow solution would work. But if it's a deep crisis, we're going to need some deep remediation. We're going to need some deep analysis. We're going to need a deep spiritual and intellectual transformation. So this is some of the, so my whole sense of worldview and cosmology was indelibly and profoundly shaped by my encounter with Thomas Berry when I was, in my early 20s. And I studied with Thomas Berry for the last 19, 20 years of his life. And so I've continued to think about cosmology and worldview and story. So Thomas Berry, again, now everybody's talking about the power of story. It's almost become a little bit of a trend, almost become a little bit of a cliche. But Berry was talking about this decades and decades ago. And he said, if we want to understand and transform the ecological crisis, we have to do it on the level of story, on the level of worldview, on the level of cosmology. So the modern Western cosmology, has been that nature is matter, that nature is a resource to be exploited. Whereas all of the traditional worldviews, all of the indigenous cosmologies would, of course, perceive nature as a living, intelligent, wise, sacred, mysterious, creative unfolding. And so what Berry was saying is that we need to shake off this old story and we need to create a new story that really is both new in the sense that we do have a new understanding of the universe through 20th century science and astronomy, and there is a new cosmological story, but it's a very ancient and traditional story as well. It's the story of indigenous peoples. It's the story of the kind of organic oneness of the human, the earth, and the universe that you see in Confucian philosophy, for example. Like I say, you can find it a lot of places, because if modern Western culture is the only culture that has taken this turn, then all of the other cultures provide a deep lineage of spiritual resources for thinking about the connections between the human, the earth, and the cosmos. And so as I continued to reflect on Thomas Berry's work and continued to study with him and read his writings and meet with him, I began to also be interested in the connections between cosmology and social justice. Of course, Berry was talking mostly about the connections between cosmology and worldview and the ecological crisis. But once he had given me this lens of cosmology, worldview, narrative, the power of story, then you kind of begin to see it everywhere, right? And I remember one day I was reading the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. King wrote, I guess it's from a speech. He said, and it's from a speech that he gave like 10 days before he was assassinated. And he said, a nation that will hold people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, will treat them as things. I thought that was very interesting, coinage, thingify. And I think I know where, now years later, I think I've found where Dr. King might have got this term, thingify, thingification. There's a African writer named Aimé Césaire, who in 1954 wrote an essay, and in the essay there's a great short sentence that just says, colonization equals thingification. Colonization equals thingification. And so as soon as I read this passage, but I didn't know that at the time. I was just reading Martin Luther King, and he said, a nation that will hold people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, will treat them as things. And as soon as I read that, it immediately sent my mind back to sitting with Thomas Berry just a year or two before. And it was just me and Thomas Berry, and we were sitting in his home. And he said to me, he said, people say that you shouldn't treat a person as a thing. And that's a good saying, in a certain sense. But you shouldn't even treat a thing as a thing. Because there's no such thing as a thing. And I remember being so struck by now. I'm reading Martin Luther King, who's a social justice, civil rights, human rights thinker. But it's immediately reminding me of a similar expression that I had heard from Thomas Berry, who's an ecological, environmental, cosmological thinker. And so it impressed upon me. I was already thinking along these lines, but it struck me that this was a powerful example of how the principles, the essence of ecology and social justice are really one, are unified. And so one of Thomas Berry's most famous epigraphs, if you will, is he said, Thomas Berry said, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. It's the same thing as when he says there's no such thing as a thing. Even what you think of as a thing, this chair, this monitor, this microphone, even that is not an object. It's a subject. That everything has its own subjectivity, its own spirit, its own inner coherence, its own spontaneity. And so Thomas Berry, this ethical formulation, another way he said it once, is the universe is composed of subjects to be communed with, not objects to be exploited. And so if we think of that, that's a basic principle that connects ecology, social justice, cosmology. What is social justice? It's treating people, sacred realities, subjects, as if they were objects, as if they were resources. I mean, literally, that's what slavery is, treating people like property, right? Exploiting, treating sacred realities, people, in the case of social justice, as exploitable objects. But we see the same thing happening in the ecological realm. When an ecosystem is razed, is burned, is clear-cut, so that a corporation can make more profit. We've treated the entire planet as an object to be exploited, rather than a subject to be communed with. Right? Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. For one instant to dwell in the presence of the galaxies. For one instant to live in the truth of the heart. The poet says this entire traveling cosmos is the secret one, slowly growing a body. Two eagles are mating, clasping each other's claws and turning cartwheels in the sky. Grasses are blooming, grandfathers dying, consciousness blinking on and off. All of this is happening at once. All of this vibrating into existence out of nothingness. Every particle foaming into existence, transcribing the ineffable. Every particle foaming into existence, transcribing the ineffable. Arising and passing away. Arising and passing away. 23 trillion times per second. When Buddha saw that, he smiled. 16 million tons of rain are falling every second on the planet, an ocean perpetually falling, and every drop is your body. Every motion, every feather, every thought is your body. Time is your body. And the infinite, curled inside like invisible rainbows folded into light. Every word of every tongue is love telling a story to her own ears. Let our lives be incense, burning like a hymn to the sacred body of the universe. My religion is rain. My religion is stone. My religion reveals itself to me in sweaty epiphanies. Every leaf, every river, every animal, your body, every creature trapped in the gears of corporate nightmares, every species made extinct was once your body. 10 million people are dreaming that they're flying. Junipers and violets are blossoming, stars exploding and being born. God is having deja vu. I am one elaborate crush. We cry petals as the void is singing. You are the dark that holds the stars in intimate distance, that spun the whirling world into existence. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. Thank y'all so much. I got to keep my eye on the time here because there's so much I want to share, but we've got a full evening with some writing exercises. We're going to do some scribbling in just a minute. I'm going to give y'all a chance to do some writing exercises in a very low pressure, loving and fun space. And then we got the open mic. That's going to be awesome. Okay. But I do want to say a little bit about say a little bit more about social justice, gender justice, economic justice, racial justice. And now we've got all these issues with like the resurgence of fascism. Like we've had all of these injustices have been consistent problems in the modern period. But now we've kind of got like a resurgent fascism that's happening. The politics of the United States has gone completely off the rails since the last time I was here. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us. I think it goes without saying that we're called to be peacemakers and that we're called to work for justice and that we're called to contribute to community and compassion and understanding and solidarity. And so some of the and so I think we need to get a hold of this fascism and these attacks on democracy and these attacks on the rule of law. But we also, for those of us who are white, particularly, and male, and otherwise have various forms of privilege, it's incumbent upon us to help dismantle these structures of oppression. And so I think, we could look at all of these heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, patriarchy, gender oppression, classism, militarism, poverty. But let me just read a little something about white supremacy and systemic racism. This is a quote from Charles Mills, who's a philosopher, and this is from a book that Charles Mills wrote called The Racial Contract. But Mills writes, "White supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today." White supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. You will not find this term in introductory or even advanced texts in political theory. A standard undergraduate philosophy course will start off with Plato and Aristotle, perhaps say something about Augustine, Aquinas, and Machiavelli, move on to Hobbes, Locke, Mill, and Marx, and then wind up with Rawls and Nozick. It will introduce you to notions of aristocracy, democracy, absolutism, liberalism, representative government, socialism, welfare capitalism, and libertarianism. But though it covers more than 2,000 years of Western political thought and runs the ostensible gamut of political systems, there will be no mention of the basic political system that has shaped the world for the past several hundred years. And this omission is not accidental. So white supremacy is, and it's, though it's often seen as most acute in the United States, it's become, the US version of racism has become globalized. And so we have, I've got plenty of other quotes that I could read you where you will hear scholars talking about a global racist order. And I think part of what's interesting about white supremacy is that it's a worldview. Again, we're back to this issue of cosmology. If you look at, here's a quote from Dr. Audrey Smedley, who wrote in 1993, she wrote, "I define race as a worldview. In the United States, Australia, South Africa, and in many other areas of the world, it is a cosmological ordering system that divides the world's peoples into biologically discrete and exclusive groups." Isn't that interesting? She uses the word cosmological ordering system as she's talking about race and racism as a worldview. So again, this issue of worldview, of cosmology, of story, of narrative, it's very profound and is one of the things that connects ecological issues and social justice issues. Sorry, I'm having paper management issues here. As per usual. Hold on just 1 second. So I think part of what's exciting about our time, I mean, there's so many crises. Like I say, I know many of you are involved in social justice work and ecological work, and so I don't need to prattle on about the various ecological and social issues. But I think part of what's exciting about this time is that we are in a time where the dysfunction of the modern worldview and the dysfunction of the current system is becoming dramatically apparent. And so it does offer us some leverage points and some potential and some space and some traction where we can assist this transformation into what a new human society could look like and how humans could reinvent their presence on the planet. And again, a lot of this has to do with acknowledging, honoring, and centering indigenous wisdom. Because indigenous traditions not only have a rapport with the natural world that has been lost in the West, but they're also the experts in dealing with colonialism. They've been resisting colonialism for 500 years. And so I think we're offered a chance. And I think this is part of what's powerful about cosmology. If you remember the first verses that I read, I said we're standing on a planet that is shooting through space, and it's time we started acting like it. I think the cosmological story gives us access to a perspective in which we can move beyond patriarchy, move beyond Cartesian dualism and the disenchantment of the world, move beyond the sense that the earth is a resource to be exploited rather than a subject to be communed with. Thomas Berry, and that's exciting. Thinking about transforming our modern societies into the societies of the future is thrilling, actually, and can't come too soon, because we know that with the acceleration of the climate crisis, with the mass extinction crisis, that this current system can't go on. You can't have an infinite industrial plundering and seemingly infinite social injustices on an interconnected, limited planet. I mean, something's got to give. So either the modern worldview will continue, or the planet as an integrated, functioning community will continue, but probably not both, if you see what I'm saying. So let me read a few more poems, because I don't want to go on too long, and I do want to share a couple more poems with you. But if we could see ourselves as part of this cosmological unfolding, this is part of the brilliance of what Thomas Berry was talking about. He's saying we have a new story. Yes, we're going to be drawing on the wisdom of indigenous traditions, and that's incredibly important. And we also have a new story that's emerging from science itself. And the new story from science is telling us that we are part of an interconnected energy that is the cosmos itself, that has been unfolding in various forms for some 13.8 billion years. And so we are part of the creativity of the galaxies. I mean, we're galactic beings. When you take the story from science and you see it and feel it in your heart and activate it in your imagination, then it becomes a powerful story of our interconnectedness and our intimacy with this sacred unfolding. And so what Thomas Berry would say is that we need to reinvent the human. We need to reinvent the human, he said, within the community of life systems by means of story and shared dream experience. Think about that. That's exciting. As miserable as the politics and the injustice and the fascism, as dispiriting as all that is, the prospect of reinventing the human by means of story and shared dream experience, that's enticing. That's a noble calling. That's what Thomas Berry would call the great work of our time. He said every civilizational era has a great work, and that if we can align our individual work, our individual quantum of energy and intellect and creativity, get that in line with what is being asked of us, what we're being called to, then we can align our personal work with the great work of our time. And Berry felt that reinventing the human within the Earth community by means of story and shared dream experience was the great work of our time. So here's a poem that kind of, I think, speaks to the connections between the cosmological order and the human order. It's called We Make Music. We exist amidst the scattered shards of shattered stars. We exist amidst the scattered shards of shattered stars, and we make music. We rock on this rock. We flow on this globe. We go from Muddy to Buddy, from Janice to Alanis, from Charlie Parker to Ali Farka, from Artie Shaw to Mardi Gras, from Madonna to Rihanna, from Raga to Gaga, from Ode to Joy to Soulja Boy. The earth was once lava and now sings opera. Our home is a poem. The planet is a sonnet. We exist amidst the scattered shards of shattered stars, and we make music. So I'll say a few more things and maybe do one more poem to wrap up. But let's do a little Q&A. If anybody has any questions or comments or anything they want to say, let's do a little bit of that. Yes, can we bring the lights up a tiny bit in the house? Yeah, please.
Yes, I agree with loads of the things you're saying, especially about like the importance of story and everything. But I've always thought that that the West only kind of became a real source of disconnect between humanity and the land, like when the scientific revolution kind of happened. And like for all of the good things that have come out of it, it's really also like the source of that. And even though in like the myth of Eden, like humanity was saying like we're like the sentinels of like the garden in the world, there's still like there's a reverence in that in some way, and everything was like God's creation. And like I don't know, what do you think of that? Like I've always thought that science was like a great thing in many ways, but also in some other ways like the source of this like alienation of the land.
I guess it was taped. Yeah, I think the science is a big part of it, but part of what and you don't have to agree with Thomas Berry, but part of what but just to give you a little bit of his background, this guy studied all of these traditions from the ancient Mediterranean world, the Western tradition. He wrote his first books on Buddhism. His second book was called Religions of India. He was deep into native, so he's kind of like a Joseph Campbell type, he was a cultural historian and a historian of religions. And part of what he felt was that the disconnect in the Western stream did go back further than the scientific revolution, in the sense that there's a sense in Christianity that a real emphasis on the spiritual value of the human. And also a sense that, that in a way that de-emphasized the spiritual value of nature and the world itself, right? And a sense that that there was a covenant relationship between the human and the divine, and that was the really important thing that was happening in history. So there was a shift from the cosmological, in the Western tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, a shift away from a sense of embeddedness in the because all cultures traditionally, the important thing was the cosmological order and integrating the human being into the cosmological order, so that our seasonal rituals, and even our holidays as they come down to us, were a way of stitching the human, of re-emphasizing and reconnecting and recommuning and celebrating the embeddedness of the human order within the cosmological order. But you do have a shift from the cosmological to the historical. So that, like, if you think of Passover, this is an example that Thomas Berry would use. So in the Hebrew tradition, Passover originally was a seasonal celebration. Then it becomes a celebration of, like the Exodus event. So it's like this event that happened in human history. We're moving from a seasonal cosmological celebration to an emphasis on this human historical. You see what I'm saying? So there's a way in which, in Western religion, the cosmological gets de-emphasized and the human historical gets, strengthened. And so that what's really important, what's really happening in history, the real story, is this divine human connection that's unfolding in linear time in history, right? And then, so that's kind of the sense of part of what he's saying when he says the spiritual value of the human got overemphasized, and the the anthropocentric turn is part of how we could say it too. And then you also have like Greek humanism, the Greek tradition, beautiful, powerful, wonderful. You find so many great, pre-Socratics and Epicureans and Stoics, and it's just fantastic, very rich. But there's a sense in which it's a very humanistic tradition. So you have like the spiritual value of the human, there's a lot of dualism in the Greek tradition, the separation between spirit and matter. When you start getting into that, like spirit is up here, and you have these Platonic forms, and that's the real sacred stuff, is the Platonic archetypal realm beyond the world. You see what I'm saying? So when you kind of combine the anthropocentrism of the Judeo-Christian tradition with the dualism and the separation between spirit and matter is spirit's really important and sacred, and matter, the world is kind of like, you see what I'm saying? So then, so you have some deep streams that I think that Thomas Berry would propose as being going back deeper than just the scientific revolution and the disenchantment of the world, if that makes sense. I mean, you don't have to agree, but I'm just kind of sharing Thomas Berry's perspective and mine as well. Awesome, thanks for that. Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
Thanks. I agree with much of what you said, and pretty much everything Thomas Berry has said about learning from indigenous traditions. But how do you think we should sell scientific progress when we're trying to convince others about changing, about finding a new story? What attitude should we take towards scientific progress? Because I think we'll find very few people who will say, oh, all of scientific progress has just led us to this disaster.
Yeah.
So many people will say, well, look at improvements in life expectancy and this and that and the other. I don't feel we can throw out the entire scientific progress with the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
So what do you feel is the attitude that we should take towards scientific progress? Much as we may feel enormous problems with the scientific revolution and all the Cartesian separation that it brought.
Yep. Yeah, I don't, the problem is not science per se, but it's been, it's the loss of cosmology. I remember talking to Thomas Berry toward the end of his life about science and the difference between science and cosmology, and he said the problem with science is that science can't tell you how to use science. You need cosmology for that. You need a context of wisdom to tell you whether you should blow up the moon. I mean, we've got, this is actually something that scientists proposed, like a scientist, at least at a conference or something, proposed 20, 30, 40 years ago that we could deal with flooding. I forget why he came up with this idea, but he said, we have the technology, we could blow up the moon. You see what I'm saying? Like you need wisdom to tell you what the hell you should do and what you definitely should not do. And I say blowing up the moon is one of those things that you might not want to go there. So I think I think Thomas Berry had an essay that I think is really insightful in terms of the role of science. And it's called The Fourfold Wisdom. And in that he said, we need science. But right now we have this kind of mental, rational, economically driven, technologically, it's like we've worshipped progress. And so we talk about the myth of progress. And that really is, so our commitment to science and progress and technology actually is a mythic commitment. Part of what I thought I remember being in college and reading this and going like, that's so brilliant. Because he said the driving force behind economics is not actually economic, it's mythic. It's a commitment to this idea that we're going to create a wonder world, and transcend the human condition. And so we've worshipped science. And he said we need science, but we need to integrate it into a fourfold wisdom. And he said the wisdom that we need is the wisdom of women and these traditional, like goddess-centered matriarchal civilizations. We need the wisdom of indigenous cultures and indigenous traditions and worldviews. And we need the wisdom of the religious traditions at their best, the traditional classical religious civilizations and those holy books and all of that, the first axial age and all of that good stuff. And we need the wisdom of science. So we need wisdom of women, wisdom of indigenous cultures, wisdom of the traditional religions, and the wisdom of science. So if we could that's a more appropriate, I think, approach rather than just worshiping science and technology and feeling like if we can do it, if we can split the atom, if we can create all these hundreds of new chemicals that the Earth's body has no capacity to deal with. You see what I'm saying? So I think science and technology are and Barry often said, he's like, we need science and technology. We're not going to get out of the ecological crisis without science and technology. So thank you for that. Yes?
Microwave radiation, like cell phone towers that are killing off the bees, and smartphones are toxic on so many levels. And And yet, you know, I've noticed that even people who are ecological people, a lot of them still using smartphones. This awareness is, there's like a big wake up now about microwave radiation. It's quite a hard thing to conceptualize because it's invisible.
Right.
But it's kind of on a scale with the tobacco industry, to be honest with you. But anyway, and then there's this weird sort of somewhat kind of split that I've noticed where the people who in the ecology movement that I speak to, some of them are so obsessed with carbon and focused on carbon emissions that if you sort of show them like the equal, you know, amount of science about microwave radiation, they say you're a conspiracy theorist. And that's partly because a lot of the sort of solutions that are being mooted as to the ecological sort of crisis are smart solutions. And that is very, very concerning if you actually understand the science of, for example, 5G technology.
Right.
But anyway, so with all of that is quite interesting, like in a lot of ways. But it just makes me wonder, cosmologically, whether you have any kind of sense of what's happening there in terms of like the Zoroastrian kind of idea of Ahriman, who is this kind of like dry, ancient AI basically that manifests itself in sort of smart tech and stuff. Can you
Love a Zoroastrianism reference. I'm not familiar with Ahriman,
right.
but.
Well, do you have a feeling about sort of tech and its kind of cosmological kind of, you know, cosmological picture that's kind of weird? I mean,
This
how
is
do you
good.
feel towards your smartphone, for example?
I'm very scared of it, actually, and I resisted it for a long time, and now I'm, of course, totally stuck on it all day. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say, but I do think, I think, you know, we're going to have to develop, you know, for those of us in the West, you know, are going to have to reconnect with our shamanic and our mystical and our spiritual modes of knowing. You know, the West has been so, you know, scientific and so mental rational. And I think that, you know, just thinking about the previous question as well, is that we're going to need some kind of shamanic experience of deep sources of wisdom that are going to help us get, hopefully, help us get these technologies under control. But I think you're absolutely right. I think, you know, that some of these, they put a smart meter on my house, an electricity meter, and I got it. Yeah, I had to pay extra money to get them to take it off my house. But my neighbor's got one, you know, 10 feet away. So I'm, you know, and I know somebody who had a smart meter put on his house while he was out of town, and he came back to his apartment in San Francisco, and he couldn't stay in his apartment. And then that triggered his sensitivities, and then he couldn't. I mean, this guy. I mean, it actually breaks my heart to think about. He had to go to the mountains of Santa Cruz and live in a tent. I mean, this is a guy who had a job in the city and was living in San Francisco and all this stuff, and they put a smart meter on it, and it triggered some sensitivity in him where he couldn't even be downtown where all the Wi-Fi's, you know, were in every cafe. So, and last I heard, he was miserable and living in a tent in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So I think these are very profound issues that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, let's take one or two. We got to keep moving in terms. I mean, I feel like I've got so much more that I could share with y'all, but let's take one last question. Yes, sir.
Is there science to having sort of a one consciousness? Because to extend, there's sort of a thing where, you know, if you want to connect to your spirit, it's like looking into yourself, etc. Guru. But then to actually like correspond and cooperate, is there sort of a science, you know, that you've heard of in your studies, in your research, that can sort of to put it in a way, put logic into, you know, being the same as one another in a more sort of spiritual consciousness? else. You know what I'm saying?
I think so. Well, I think that's part of what is exciting about the new sciences is that they're reconnecting with ancient spiritual, mystical, shamanic, and traditional wisdom, and most wisdom traditions acknowledge that we're all interconnected. I mean, it's become a cliche. You know, you got the person, you know, saying the prayer and saying we're all one. You know, but it's fascinating when you look at every tradition. They talk about oneness, interdependence, interconnectedness. And that's part of what. So I think it's a profound validation of that our newest sciences are on the right track. That they're reconnecting with mystical, spiritual, shamanic understandings of the interrelatedness, interdependence, and interconnectedness of the cosmos, the planet, and all life. And so I think whether we look at complexity sciences or chaos theory. We look at, and this is in the West. This is very new. For the modern West, this is kind of a connection that we can talk about, especially in the last 50 years. But in indigenous, so I started laughing because I just thought about this cartoon. There's a political cartoon, like a one-panel cartoon that I saw. And it had these two Native Americans, and they were sitting at like a diner. And one Native American, you can tell a Native American, they got a big braid, black hair, dark braid. And one sitting next to his friend at a diner, and he's got the newspaper open. And he's saying to his friend, he says, "Oh, it says here that scientists have just discovered that the Earth is alive, and that we're all one." With the joke being, oh yeah, and then the other guy's going like, wow, what will they discover next? So I think, but in the West, there has been this, we look at the ecological movement, it was 50 years ago. Well, it was just over 50 years ago that humans left Earth's orbit for the first time on the Apollo 8 mission. The Apollo 8 mission didn't land on the moon. We're coming up in just a couple of weeks on the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. But the Apollo 8, which was Apollo 11, right? The Apollo 8 mission was the first one. Other folks had gone up since the mid-60s or the early 60s and orbited the Earth. But the Apollo 8 was the first mission to leave Earth orbit and to go and orbit the moon. And so that's when we got the famous Earthrise photograph. And so when those three astronauts on Apollo 8 were circling the moon and they came around the edge of the moon and saw the Earth as a unity, as a whole, and they snapped that, and William Anders snapped that famous photograph on December 24th, 1968. That was a new cosmological vision for the West. And so it was just over 50 years ago. See if I can. And it was exactly, so that was like 50 years ago this month that Apollo 11 landed on the moon and was able to look back and perceive the Earth as a unity. But exactly 100 years before that, so 150 years ago this month, John Muir, the great Scottish naturalist who went to the United States, and he spent his first summer in the Sierra Mountains in California in June of 1869, in July of 1869, and he wrote this in his journal. You may have heard a slightly different version of this, but this is the original version of the quote that he wrote in his journal on July 27th, 1869. John Muir wrote, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe." When we try to pick out anything by itself, we found that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe. And so just as I wrap up, that's part of what intrigued me when I was reading Martin Luther King's work, and I saw that he was writing about interrelatedness. He was writing about interconnectedness. He was writing about interdependence. Dr. King used to say, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. And I was like, that's amazing. I mean, that for Dr. King, who again we think of as civil rights, human rights, social justice, he's talking about interconnectedness, interdependence, interrelatedness. That's ecology. That's cosmology. And so I began tracing him saying all life is interrelated. And I found at least a dozen times throughout the 1960s. And every time that Dr. King would say this teaching that all life is interrelated, he would preface it with a statement to emphasize the centrality and the importance of it. So I found him giving a sermon where he said, all I'm saying, my friends, is this, that all life is interrelated. Or another time he says, all I'm saying this morning is this, that all life is interrelated. And in one of his books he writes, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. And then toward the end of his life he said, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. So he didn't just say that all life is interrelated, he prefaced it with this statement to emphasize that it's not just that all life is interrelated, but the fact that all life is interrelated is at the core, at the center, is the essence of everything that Dr. King was talking about, and all of his work for social justice, and all of his work against militarism and racism and poverty, and all of his work for peace, and all of his work for community and human solidarity is based on his cosmological systems thinking and his recognition. He would sometimes say that I can't be who I'm meant to be unless you are who you're meant to be, and you can't be who you're meant to be unless I am whom I'm meant to be. And he said, this is the way our universe is structured. This is Dr. King. You don't hear this ecological, cosmological side. This is part of what I've been bringing forward, and I've got some essays on Martin Luther King as an ecological thinker at the back, and I've got some free articles that you're welcome to take. I also have some books for sale, but he said, this is the way our universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality, and we aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I'd love to share some more poems. Maybe during the open mic I can share another one or so, but I think that's it for the talk part, so thank you so much for your